Every economic slowdown leaves fingerprints, not in bold headlines, rarely in dramatic announcements. They show up somewhere quieter, in the gradual disappearance of ordinary things. And if you pay close attention, you may have already noticed one or two of them. A promotion that never lands in your inbox, a store aisle that feels just a little less stocked than it used to, a service you assumed would always be there, quietly scaled back without explanation. Nothing sudden, nothing loud, just a subtle shift that most people dismiss until the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. If you look back at past slowdowns, certain things almost always fade before others. Small signals, subtle adjustments, early withdrawals. The kinds of changes that don't trend on social media. The kinds of changes that rarely make the evening news. But once you recognize them, you start to see the sequence forming long before the broader narrative catches up. That's the difference between reacting late and quietly understanding what's unfolding in real time. If you've ever had the sense that something was shifting before anyone said it out loud, this is for you. Today, we're breaking down 10 things that consistently disappear first during periods of financial strain, based on observable historical behavior and economic psychology. Some of them are obvious, a few are more subtle than you might expect, and at least one tends to surprise people every cycle. This isn't about predicting anything, and it's not about sounding alarms. It's about recognizing the quiet signals that often appear before larger adjustments begin, so you can understand the environment clearly instead of being caught off guard by it. Let's begin. The quiet signals we just talked about aren't random. There's a reason they tend to appear in a similar order, even across very different economic cycles. A useful place to begin is something behavioral economists call loss aversion. It's a simple idea. Losses feel heavier than gains feel good. When the economy feels strong, people lean toward opportunity, trying new things, upgrading, expanding into possibilities that feel exciting. But when growth slows, attention shifts. The internal question changes from "what can I gain?" to "what could I lose?" And that shift, subtle but powerful, begins influencing everyday decisions. The same household that once optimized for enjoyment gradually begins optimizing to avoid regret. Instead of adding a subscription, they cancel one. Instead of upgrading a device, they stretch its lifespan. Instead of experimenting, they stabilize. Closely connected to this is risk reduction. When conditions feel stable, uncertainty feels manageable. But when signals become mixed, slower hiring, tighter credit, uneven earnings, people instinctively narrow their exposure. They postpone optional purchases, they delay renovations, they stick with brands they already trust rather than testing something unfamiliar. Predictability begins to feel safer than novelty. It's usually not panic, it's recalibration. Another long-standing concept in economic theory is liquidity preference, the tendency to favor cash or easily accessible resources when uncertainty rises. The term itself has existed for decades, but the instinct behind it is straightforward. Liquidity creates flexibility, and psychologically, flexibility feels like control. You see it when households build larger emergency buffers, when businesses hold back expansion capital, when investors shift toward assets they can exit quickly if needed. As uncertainty lingers, other patterns tend to follow. Consumers shorten their planning horizons, businesses emphasize efficiency over expansion. Investors prioritize resilience over aggressive growth. None of it feels dramatic in isolation. Most of it unfolds quietly, in small adjustments that compound over time. Across decades of economic cycles, human psychology hasn't changed nearly as much as we assume. Markets move in numbers, but beneath those numbers are individuals, responding not only to data, but also to perception, memory, and the deep instinct to preserve stability. And that psychology explains why certain things tend to disappear first, not because they're unimportant, but because under pressure, they become negotiable.
So what does that actually look like in real life? Let's start with number 10. So what does that actually look like in real life? At number 10, limited edition and trend-driven products. Imagine walking into a store and noticing the seasonal flavors, influencer collaborations, or limited-run gadgets are suddenly harder to find. Historically, these tend to fade early during slower economic periods, not because they collapse, but because they depend on discretionary enthusiasm. When financial conditions feel less certain, novelty becomes optional. Under tighter constraints, people gravitate toward utility and familiarity. Retailers respond quickly. Limited runs are expensive to promote and harder to predict, so companies simplify. Fewer experiments, less variety, more focus on what reliably sells. The shift isn't dramatic, it's a quiet narrowing of choice. And when experimentation slows, the next change often shows up somewhere even more familiar. At number 9, premium upgrades and nice-to-have add-ons. Think about the upgraded hotel room, the premium streaming tier, the deluxe version of a product you already use. These rarely disappear entirely, but demand often softens early. Loss aversion plays a subtle role here. When budgets feel tighter, purchases are filtered differently. Essential or enhancement? The standard version still works. The end grade improves the experience. Under uncertainty, function usually wins. Companies adjust quietly. Promotions lean toward core offerings. Higher tiers receive less emphasis. The market gradually shifts toward practicality. And once upgrades are reconsidered, another category often slows, one tied to longer-term confidence. At number 8, big-ticket commitments. A new car, a major renovation, a long-term subscription. These decisions don't vanish overnight, but historically, they begin to slow early. Large commitments require confidence in future income. When signals grow mixed, even financially stable households may delay, not cancel, but postpone. Flexibility starts to feel more valuable than locking in to sizable obligations. Businesses sense that hesitation. Financing becomes more cautious, production plans tighten, messaging shifts from aspiration to value. And when long-term commitments pause, something even more foundational begins to shift: how people redefine what truly feels essential.
Across economic cycles, these categories don't fade randomly. They tend to recede in a recognizable sequence, from indulgences to enhancements to commitments. As caution deepens, the pattern moves closer to everyday habits. At number 7, entertainment outside the home. Picture a typical Friday night. Dinner out, movie tickets, a live event, rideshare both ways. Individually, none of it feels excessive. Together, it's layered discretionary spending. Historically, when growth slows, households start reassessing recurring leisure costs. Loss aversion nudges people toward preserving comfort at home rather than paying for temporary experiences. Cooking replaces dining out. Streaming replaces theaters. It's not about eliminating enjoyment. It's about controlling variables. Businesses feel this shift quickly. Restaurants shorten hours, venues reduce event schedules, promotions increase, but margins tighten. The ecosystem around optional outings becomes more fragile. And once experiences outside the home are reconsidered, attention often turns inward, toward personal upgrades. At number 6, cosmetic and appearance-based spending. Salon visits, aesthetic treatments, premium grooming services, trend-driven wardrobe refreshes. These categories are tied closely to confidence and visibility. Under stable conditions, they feel routine. But historically, when uncertainty rises, durability begins to outweigh presentation. Maintaining flexibility can feel more important than maintaining frequency. Appointments stretch from 4 weeks to 6, then 8. That shift alone can alter revenue patterns quickly. Businesses respond with bundled discounts, loyalty incentives, or simplified service packages. The change isn't about abandoning self-care, it's about adjusting cadence. And as visible consumption slows, another shift often appears, this time inside the household budget itself. At number 5, subscription accumulation. Open a bank statement and count the renewals, streaming platforms, software tools, membership boxes, app upgrades. Individually, small, collectively, meaningful. During expansion cycles, subscriptions grow quietly because they feel manageable. But when uncertainty lingers, recurring charges draw more scrutiny. Liquidity preference encourages reducing fixed outflows to regain flexibility. Subscription businesses rely heavily on inertia. When cancellation rates tick up, even slightly, companies consolidate tiers, bundle services, or introduce ad-supported options to stabilize revenue. The change isn't rarely dramatic, it's a steady trimming of commitments. And when recurring costs begin to shrink, the next adjustment often reveals something deeper about long-term confidence. At number 4, expansion plans that quietly pause. Picture a company preparing to open a new location, launch a product extension, enter a new regional market. The strategy may still exist on paper, but timelines begin to stretch. Historically, when growth signals soften, organizations shift from expansion to preservation. It mirrors what households do, just at a larger scale. Leadership teams focus on efficiency, cash flow stability, operational resilience. The instinct is simple: protect what already exists before pursuing what's next. Expansion requires capital, hiring, marketing support, and coordination across teams. When uncertainty rises, long-term returns feel harder to forecast, so plans slow. Not abandoned, just delayed. The public rarely notices these pauses immediately, but over time, fewer openings, launches, and announcements subtly reshape the landscape. And when expansion slows, another adjustment often follows, one even less visible to consumers. At number 3, internal budget tightening. This doesn't usually make headlines. It appears in revised quarterly targets, trimmed discretionary spending within departments, closer review of vendor contracts. Institutions respond to uncertainty much like individuals do. When risk rises, protecting margins often feels safer than stretching for growth. Managers become more selective. Projects must justify themselves more rigorously. In practical terms, that can mean reduced advertising, postponed software upgrades, slower equipment replacement cycles. None of these changes signal collapse, they signal recalibration. Over time, this internal tightening shapes the broader environment, influencing hiring, supplier relationships, and even product availability. And as institutional caution deepens, it begins to affect something even more foundational than budgets. At number 2, access to easy credit. This shift rarely feels dramatic at first. Approval processes take longer, promotional financing becomes more selective, credit limits expand more cautiously. On the surface, the system still works, but friction increases. Historically, access to credit reflects collective risk appetite. When lenders sense greater uncertainty, standards tighten, not out of panic, out of protection. Credit depends on confidence in future repayment. When forecasts grow less clear, institutions lean toward resilience rather than expansion. Consumers respond in parallel. Applications slow, borrowers hesitate before taking on variable obligations. Flexibility begins to outweigh leverage. Because modern spending is closely tied to financing, even subtle tightening reshapes behavior. Fewer approvals ripple outward into housing, vehicles, business formation, and investment decisions. And when credit becomes more selective, something even less tangible begins to shift. At number 1, collective confidence in the future. Not headline optimism, but the quiet assumption that tomorrow will build on today. Consumer confidence has always been more than a survey metric. It shows up in long-term decisions, the willingness to commit, to relocate, to invest in new skills, to start something that may take years to grow. When confidence softens, planning horizons shorten. People think in months instead of years. This is deeply psychological. Opportunity may still exist, but uncertainty begins to feel heavier. Loss aversion magnifies potential downside, even when fundamentals remain stable. Historically, perception moves first, before budgets tighten, before projects pause, before credit adjusts. The shift begins internally. And in every cycle, the most powerful force isn't the product that disappears, it's the story people tell themselves about what comes next.
If history shows us anything, it's that economic cycles are not anomalies, they are rhythms. Periods of acceleration are followed by moderation, expansion gives way to recalibration, and eventually momentum returns, often in a different form. What changes from cycle to cycle is not human psychology, but circumstance. The patterns we've discussed, shifts in spending, tightening credit, reduced risk appetite, have appeared in different decades, under different technologies, and across different industries. The surface details evolve, the behavioral foundations remain surprisingly consistent. Understanding these patterns doesn't create them, it simply makes them easier to recognize. And recognition reduces surprise. When people realize certain behaviors are structural rather than personal, the narrative shifts. It becomes less about alarm and more about awareness, less about reacting and more about observing. Markets move, sentiment fluctuates, institutions adjust, individuals recalibrate. None of that is abnormal. It's how complex systems maintain balance over time. Calm thinking has always been more durable than fear-driven conclusions. Perspective outlasts headlines. And perhaps the most useful insight is this: cycles shape behavior, but behavior over time reshapes the cycle.